My name is Erin Lasley. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Hey everyone, how's it going? How's life treating you? I am noticing some renewed energy since I climbed out of my funk. I actually rolled out of bed the other morning without hitting snooze 4 times and kept that energy going throughout most of the day. With the help of 4 or 5 cups of coffee, of course, but the important thing is that I have more energy and I am smiling more and making big plans for the future. Lots of great things on the horizon. Okay, so let's get straight into this episode. Does anyone still get excited about the Olympics? As a kid, I was enthralled by them, even though I wasn't really big into sports. I loved watching the figure skating during the Winter Olympics and the gymnastics during the Summer Games. I guess as a kid, I found it magical how the whole world, or at least most of the world, could come together in peace to celebrate sportsmanship. During the Summer Games, I was always allowed to stay up a little bit later and watch the retelecasting of some of the games and the commentary that aired late into the night. That's what I was doing in 1996 when a bomb went off in Atlanta. That evening and early into the next morning, I watched the news with my mom. And I must have said something about how violence at the Olympics is unthinkable. That's when she told me about a tragedy at the 1972 Olympics. At the age of 13, I really didn't know a lot about terrorism, or the backlash Israel faced when it declared itself a nation, or the suffering of Palestinians. I couldn't wrap my young mind around why anyone would place a bomb among people who came together in peace, let alone why a group of men would take hostages and kill athletes at the Olympics. Part of me still can't understand the cruelty. But that day did make me expand my interest from true crime into terrorism, just in time for an adult life dominated by global terrorism. Before we go much further, I want to address something about the last episode when I gave a little background about the Jewish migration to Palestine and Israel. I received an email from someone who said the word Zionism was offensive and anti-Semitic. Yes and no. This is where historical context and research comes in. The term Zionism and Zionists comes from the Hebrew phrase that pretty much means lovers of Zion, which came from a 19th century movement in Russia and Eastern Europe to inspire Jews to migrate to Palestine. We talked a little bit about that in last episode. In the late 19th century, Zionism became more of a political nationalistic idea inspired by Theodor Herzl in his book, The Jewish State, which is not surprising because nationalism was sweeping across Europe at the time. The term Zionism and Zionist is the appropriate historical term to reference the movement of the Jewish people who migrated to Palestine in the 19th and 20th centuries. Since then, those terms have been used by some people as anti-Semitic slurs or to voice their opposition to Israel. Anti-Zionists believe that the Zionist movement is akin to colonialism and is racist against Palestinians and Muslims in general. As I have said several times before, history is complex. Many terms have different meanings depending on the time frame you are referencing. It's important to study these different definitions to appropriately understand history. For this episode, I sat down and I read Simon Reeve's book, One Day in September, which was also made into a great documentary. I also used several newspaper sources from the time and anniversary articles from the Washington Post and NPR. As a historian, I try to imagine what the world thought when it was announced that the 1972 Summer Olympics would be held in Munich, Germany, West Germany. Less than 30 years before, West Germany was Nazi Germany. And in the 1970s, the world was still trying to heal from the devastation Hitler and his goons wrought upon the world. But Munich wanted to show the world that it had changed. Gone were the days of the swastika and anti Semitism. Munich wanted everyone to know they were open to all creeds and color, and everyone was welcome in their city. Thousands of journalists, photographers, and news crews from all around the world gathered in Munich, not only to document the games, but to chronicle a new Germany free from its horrible past. One of the more inspirational stories involved the Israeli team. As you can imagine, some of the athletes and staff were probably more than a bit apprehensive about participating in an Olympic game hosted by a country that quite recently tried to annihilate them and their people. Some people on the Israeli team were Holocaust survivors who had escaped Germany or other countries before the mass slaughter occurred, or, by the grace of God, actually survived concentration camps. Though Israel sent its largest Olympic delegation ever, many of the athletes faced personal demons being in a country that once wanted them dead and had to contend with the fact that the Dachau concentration camp was just a few miles from the Olympic venue. Some confessed they had eerie feelings that something bad would happen. Something would, but that threat didn't come from old ghosts. It came from new demons. In the last episode, I gave a very general breakdown of the mass Jewish immigration into Palestine and the creation of Israel. During the immigration, and then the creation of the Jewish state, and then the wars between Israel and Arab countries, there were thousands of Palestinian refugees who fled to neighboring countries such as Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Many of these refugees were normal people who got pushed out of their homes or had an actual fear of the Israeli government and military. But some were Palestinian fighters who took advantage of foreign governments' financing, military training, or just simply a government's willingness to turn a blind eye to a paramilitary group's training in their backyard. One of these groups was called Black September. Pretty much, they had escaped from Israel to Jordan to train to be freedom fighters. I ask that you don't roast me too much for this, but at the beginning, I kind of think their cause was a little bit noble. Their homes were invaded, their livelihoods were taken away from them. Probably people they knew had been killed, and they were forced out of their homeland. Ask yourself, wouldn't that turn you into a freedom fighter too? At the time, the King of Jordan was more than happy to host these fighters because Jordan had, after all, attacked Israel in the beginning. However, some of these fighters, under the leadership of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which we'll call PLO from now on, attempted a coup against the Jordanian king, and this was known as the Jordanian Civil War, and it occurred in September 1970. The king ultimately prevailed, and attempted to kick out the PLO and the rest of the Palestinian fighters. This is where the group Black September sprung from, and their somewhat noble cause turned into something incredibly dark. Black September made their debut on November 28, 1971, in an act of revenge against Jordan. On that day, Black September commandos assassinated Wasfi Tel, the Prime Minister of Jordan, in an upscale hotel in Cairo, Egypt. As Tel lay dying on the hotel lobby floor, one of the commandos actually licked up some of the blood from Tel's chest wound. Gross. The Egyptian police promptly arrested the group, and the rest of the world thought that the attack, it was just a fluke. They were wrong. About 3 weeks later, the group struck again in London. In a brazen attack, taken straight out of the Al Capone gangster playbook, a Black September gunman stood on the side of a London road with an automatic assault rifle hidden under his raincoat and waited for the Jordanian ambassador, Zayed El Rifai, to drive by on his way to the Jordanian embassy. When the ambassador finally came his way, the gunman held the rifle at waist level and delivered a barrage of 30 rounds into the ambassador's car. The ambassador was shot in the hand and crashed his car into a wall, but he survived. The gunman dived into a getaway car and disappeared. Black September immediately claimed responsibility. Black September struck in other places in Europe after the assassination attempt in London. On February 6, 1972, Black September murdered 5 Jordanians in Germany who had been accused of working with Israel. And 2 days later, Black September destroyed a factory in Hamburg that made engines for Israel. A few days after that, they damaged a pipeline in Hamburg belonging to Esso Oil. They upped their game in May 1972 and hijacked a plane flying from Brussels to Tel Aviv. 4 Black September terrorists took 87 passengers and crew members hostage and demanded the release of over 200 Palestinian prisoners. When the plane landed at Tel Aviv, a member of the ground crew simply walked over to the plane, let the air out of all the plane's tires, and drained the hydraulics, therefore debilitating the aircraft and making it impossible for the hijackers to fly off. Negotiators stalled the terrorists until a crack team of Israeli special forces was ready to storm the plane and take out the terrorists. 2 terrorists were killed. 2 were taken captive. The failed attack humiliated Black September, and they swore revenge. Shortly after the attack, a Black September leader headed off to Lebanon for a terrorist conference. I shit you not, a conference that included not just Middle Eastern terrorist groups, but those from Ireland, Germany, and even Japan. Together, they hatched a plan to attack Lod Airport in Tel Aviv. On May 30th, both Black September and Japanese Red Army gunmen opened fire on a crowd of people at the baggage claim, killing 24 people, mostly religious pilgrims from Puerto Rico. One gunman was accidentally killed by his own man. Another was captured before he could blow up a plane with a grenade. The attack was the first time Black September worked with other nations' terrorist groups. But it wasn't the last. I've sometimes wondered what Rome would be like in summertime. I can imagine walking through busy streets, marveling at the ancient wonders as the Italian sun warms my skin, enjoying a cup of coffee or glass of wine at an outdoor cafe, and maybe overhearing the 3 men at the next table next to me developing a plan to kidnap and ransom Israeli Olympic athletes. My friends, not all terrorist attacks are planned in dingy basements or caves. Sometimes they are planned in picturesque outdoor Roman cafes in the middle of peak tourist season. At least that's what happened in this case. And before we go much farther, I really do apologize for butchering a lot of names. In July 1972, Black September terrorists Abu Duwad, Abu Ilad, and Fakiri al Umari sat in a Roman cafe fuming that Palestinian athletes were denied participation in the 1972 Munich Olympics. They railed against the injustice of it all and decided to participate anyway. Not as sportsmen, but as terrorists. There, under the Roman sun, they planned to kidnap as many Israeli athletes as they could and ransom them for the release of Palestinian prisoners. Things moved pretty quickly after that. Abu Duwad flew to Munich to gather intel on the Olympic Park, while Abu Iyad put together a team for the attack. He chose Latif Afif, nicknamed Isa, to lead the attack. Not only had Isa studied in Germany, but ironically, was the son of a Jewish mother and Christian father, and whose three brothers were also members of Black September and were in prison. The co-commander was Yosef Nassal, nicknamed Tony, who also had studied in Germany. The foot soldiers were 6 men who trained in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and who were all 19 and 20 years old, practically children. All 8 of these men were angry at the Israeli government and the people who had taken their homes and pushed them into Lebanese camps. They all burned for revenge. While these men traveled to Libya for training, Duwad met with Yasser Arafat and other members of the PLO and arranged the delivery of weapons to be used during the operation. Now, it's highly doubtful Arafat knew anything about the Munich plans, but analysts and even some historians are convinced he knew that something was going down and pretty much gave Duwad his blessing. Duwad traveled back to Europe with the PLO's endorsement and picked up the weapons and Abu Iyad at an airport in Paris and stored the weapons in lockers at a train station in Munich. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It was a lot easier for terrorists to smuggle themselves and weapons on commercial flights back in the 1970s. Don't mind those metal detectors at TSA anymore, do you? On August 31st, the rest of the team arrived in Munich, retrieved their weapons, and checked into motels. They spent their time before the attack touring the city and even watching a few of the Olympic sporting events. Most of them didn't even know what their target was or what the plans were until a few hours before the attack began. Roughly during the same time the Black September terrorists were finalizing their assault plans, many athletes and coaches on the Israeli team gathered and watched Fiddler on the Roof, presented in German, and then hung out with the Israeli actor Shmuel Rodinsky. It was a good evening for the team. Some of them had participated in competition during the last week, and some had taken the games to heart, going so far as to talk with athletes from other Middle Eastern countries who actually despised Israel. All the athletes, no matter which country they were from, and no matter what their country's politics were, did their best to embrace other athletes in the spirit of the games. The 1972 Munich Olympics were meant to be the games of healing and sportsmanship. That would all come crashing down in a few hours. Around 4 a.m. Monday, September 5th, most of the Olympic athletes were asleep in their apartments in the Olympic Village. except for a small group of American athletes who were stumbling back to the village after a night of drinking. When the Americans approached the village fence, they encountered 8 men in tracksuits attempting to scale the security fencing. Thinking that the men were other athletes who had also snuck out for some fun, the Americans helped them over the fence, and then they went their separate ways. At any other games, armed security guards would have more than likely challenged both the Americans and the 8 men in tracksuits. But the 1972 games were different. The organizers didn't want a replay of the 1936 Berlin games with all the Nazi uniforms and stuff. The Munich organizers wanted low-key, unarmed security who looked more like tour guides than police. The security guards may have looked spiffy in their 1970s polyester suits, but they were ineffectual in, keeping the athletes safe. I don't think it would have mattered if the 8 men of Black September were intercepted by security guards, armed or not. These terrorists carried gym bags full of automatic rifles, pistols, and grenades. Even if security tried to stop them, many people still would have died. Possibly more people than what happened. The 8 men in tracksuits snuck through the village and stopped right outside the apartment building where some of the Israeli athletes were housed. The men quickly changed their clothes and then proceeded into the building through the unlocked door. They must have made a noise, because from his bed, Israeli wrestling referee Yosef Gutfreud got up to investigate. Upon discovering the terrorists, Gutfreud shouted a warning to the other men he housed with and threw his large bulk against the door to stop the terrorists from entering. The room erupted in chaos. Gutfreud was able to hold off the gun-wielding terrorists long enough for weightlifting trainer Tuvia Sokolovsky to escape out the window to get help. The terrorists used all their might to break into the room and forced all the men, including Gutfreud, onto the ground. Moshe Weinberg, the wrestling coach, resisted and grabbed a fruit knife and tried to stab Isa. Another terrorist shot Weinberg in the face. The terrorists then forced the still alive Weinberg to take them to more Israeli athletes. Bravely, Weinberg led the terrorists past the rooms where the fencing and shooting athletes slept, and took the terrorists instead to the rooms where the wrestling and weightlifting men were, hoping the stronger men would have a better chance against Black September. The terrorists grabbed as many athletes as they could and forced them back into the apartment where the coaches were housed. Weightlifter Gad Sabari, convinced they were all going to be executed, shoved one of the terrorists out of the way and made a mad dash down the stairs of the building into the underground basement. He later recounted that he ran in a zigzag as at least one of the terrorists shot at him. Weinberg, seizing on the distraction, once again attacked the terrorists and knocked one of them unconscious before he was shot multiple times in the chest. Yosef Romano, another weightlifter and a veteran of the Six-Day War, also fought back and tried to grab one of the terrorist guns. He actually managed to seize the pistol before he was shot and killed. The gunshots woke up the other athletes in the building, and Black September was forced to lock themselves in the coach's room with the 9 athletes they had. This is where I normally get bogged down into the details, and a 2-parter could very easily become a 3-parter. We're not going to do that this time. This is what roughly went down after Black September seized the Israeli athletes. Other Israeli athletes call for help, and an unarmed security guard arrives. Security calls the police when they spot one of the terrorists holding a Kalashnikov. A Munich police officer arrives shortly after and simply demands the terrorists leave the building because you never know. I'm just going to ask nicely. To show that they meant business, Issa orders the men to dump Weinberg's body in front of the police officer. The Munich chief of police, Manfred Schreiber, calls the Bavarian minister, who calls the federal government, who then calls the German prime minister and the foreign minister. Jewish blood is being spilt again on German soil. Schreiber arrives on scene, as do a gaggle of reporters, and the Israeli government is called. Issa plays the negotiator for Black September, and Schreiber and policewoman Anneliese Gross negotiate for the Germans. What's really interesting is that Issa was in a khaki safari suit and blackface during all of this. If it wasn't so damn serious, it would have been comical. Black September wants the release of 234 Palestinian and German Red Army prisoners held in Israel and German prisons. If the Israelis and Germans didn't release the men by 9 a.m., Black September would kill all their hostages. Strange side note. Are any of you familiar with the German Special Operations Command, or perhaps GSG 9 police unit? They're actually pretty scary and honestly make me thankful that the Germans are on our side. If an event like this were to have occurred today, both these groups would negotiate, stall for time, and then kick down the door. Unfortunately, these two groups were not around in 1972, and the only thing Schreiber had was regular police, most of which had never shot a gun outside of training. But didn't the Germans have crack snipers during World War II? Yeah, they had really good snipers, and the German army still had great marksmen. But the powers that be either didn't feel the need to bring in the army or were afraid of portraying the wrong message. Either way, this decision sealed both the hostages and the terrorists' fate. Back to the story. Schreiber and Grice negotiate with Issa, who meets them face to face outside the apartment building. News networks all over the globe break into regular scheduled programming and the Olympic Games to broadcast the hostage crisis. Also, the Olympic organizers at first refused to suspend the games during the crisis, citing something stupid like things should go on as normal, but by that afternoon reversed their decision. The world waits in horror and counts down to 9 a.m. When the time arrives, Issa agrees to extend the deadline to noon. In Israel, Prime Minister Golda Meir would be damned before she met the terrorist demands. Israel was horrified by the events, but it is quite likely they would have stood by and let the entire team be slaughtered before they gave in to the terrorists. Israelis did offer to send their commandos to put a stop to the crisis, but the West Germans politely declined. The noon deadline approaches, and Issa agrees to push the deadline to 1 p.m., and then 3 p.m., and then to 5 p.m. The German government and some of the Olympic Committee, including those from Arab countries, offer the terrorists $9 million to release the hostages. Issa replies that money means nothing to us. Our lives mean nothing to us. As the 5 p.m. deadline approaches, Schreiber and Grice again tried to push the deadline back, but this time they are acting as a distraction as 38 West German border police guards, dressed in civilian clothes, position themselves around the apartment building. They plan to crawl down the ventilation shaft and kill all the terrorists. There were just a few problems. One, these men were not trained in special tactics and barely knew how to operate the automatic weapons they carried. Two, the worldwide press had all their cameras trained on the apartment building. And three, the terrorists were watching the coverage on TV and could see the police approaching. Issa threatened to kill the hostages if the police didn't back off. When the negotiations seem to be going nowhere, Issa demands 2 planes to take the terrorists and hostages to Egypt for further negotiations. Okay, says the Germans, we'll also give you some helicopters to take you to the airport. This would give the German authorities the perfect opportunity to stage an ambush and free the hostages. During the initial negotiations, Schreiber and Grice demanded to speak with some of the hostages, both as a proof of life and to find out how the hostages were really faring. It was during this time 2 of the hostages said that they had seen 4 or 5 terrorists, and the police took them at the word, where in reality, there were 8 of them. The plan was to go down like this. An ambush would occur in the underground garage as the terrorists led their hostages to the helicopters. West German police would hide behind cars and then shoot the terrorists. However, when Issa scouted the route, one of the officers made a noise and spooked the terrorist. Issa demanded a bus to take the group from the apartment to the helicopters, which thwarted the first planned ambush. The second plan was to attack the terrorists at the airport. 5 police officers deployed to the airfield and positioned themselves on the control tower, behind a service truck, and behind a signal tower. 5 police officers in sniper roles to take out what they thought were only 5 terrorists. 5 police officers who had no experience as snipers and were outfitted with rifles that had no optics. These officers even stated they were not sharpshooters. If, by chance, the snipers failed, there were 16 officers on board the Boeing 727 ready to overpower the terrorists. But, at the last moment, the officers on board the plane voted the plan was too dangerous and simply abandoned their stations without notifying anyone. It was the making of, how we say in the military, a clusterfuck. Just after 10:30 that evening, the 2 helicopters arrived at the airport. Issa and Tony went to check the plane while the other terrorists kept an eye on the hostage and the helicopter pilots. When Issa and Tony discovered there was no one on the plane and holy shit, this is a trap, they ran back to the helicopters to warn the others. That's when the snipers took their chance. One shot at Issa and missed him entirely, hitting Tony instead. But the snipers were able to take out 2 of the terrorists, holding 2 of the pilots hostage. The terrorists returned gunfire. The pilots escaped. The hostages couldn't, and 1 sniper was killed. About this time, journalists started to arrive at the gates of the airport and could hear the gun battle going on inside. Families of the Israeli athletes watched the news with feelings of dread and hope, and the entire world held its breath with anticipation. After the firefight ended around 1:30 a.m., the initial reports claimed all the terrorists were dead and all the hostages had been saved. It was the news the world had been hoping for, and the sports broadcasters who had been covering the Olympics announced to the world that all was well, until the real truth came out. Jim McKay, a sports broadcaster for ABC, broke the news.
Final word. When I was a kid, my father used to say, our greatest hopes and our worst fears are seldom realized. Our worst fears have been realized tonight. They have now said that there were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in their rooms yesterday morning. 9 were killed at the airport tonight. They're all gone.
When the snipers opened fire against the terrorists, the Black September gunmen probably panicked. With the Kalashnikov, Issa shot 4 of the hostages at point-blank range, killing 3 of them instantly. Issa then threw a grenade into the helicopter and blew it and the hostages up. At the other helicopter, Adnan al-Ghashi killed the remaining 5 hostages with a machine gun. Israelis Zaid Friedman, David Berger, Jakob Springer, Eliezer Halfin, Josef Gutfreud, Kiat Shor, Mark Slavin, Andrei Spitzer, and Amitzer Shapira had been killed at the airport. Moshe Weinberg and Josef Romano lay dead back at the Olympic Village. Anton Fliegerbauer, a West German police officer, was shot and killed at the airport. 5 terrorists, including Issa and Tony, were shot and killed at the airport. 3 terrorists were apprehended, but they didn't stay in prison for long. When Lufthansa Flight 615 was hijacked on October 29th, the West German government exchanged 2 of the Black September terrorists for the passengers and crew. The 2 terrorists received a hero's welcome in Libya. There are many theories, that the governments of Libya and Germany arranged the hijacking in order for Germany to release the terrorists or assurances there would be no further terrorist attacks on Germany. After the terrorist attack, the Olympic Games continued, with the blessing of Israel, though Israel did fly all of its athletes home after a memorial service for their fallen teammates. It would take 44 years for the International Olympic Committee to commemorate the victims of the Munich Massacre. The Israeli government, in true Israeli fashion, sought revenge during Operation Bayonet, aka Operation Wrath of God. Mossad operators tracked down and killed anyone involved in the Munich Massacre, including Black September and PLO operatives. While the operation lasted about 20 years, Mossad was never able to find and eliminate Abu Duwad, even though several European governments intercepted him a few times. He died in Syria in 2010 of kidney failure. Jamal al-Ghazi, the 3rd surviving gunman, was last seen alive in 1999 in either North Africa or Syria. He remained in hiding for fear the Israelis would kill him. I'm sure his fears were justified. So what do we take away from all this? I guess the first would be that after 1972, the International Olympic Committee didn't mess around with security for its athletes anymore. Either the athletes would be protected or there would be no more Olympic Games. In 2008, China spent $6.5 billion on security alone. Since Munich, there have been athlete-on-athlete attacks and the bombing at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta that targeted spectators at a concert, but very few stories of violence against athletes from outside offenders. Second, many countries such as Germany, France, the UK, and the US developed special teams to respond to terrorist attacks such as what happened in Munich. The police response of the Munich massacre, rightly so, embarrassed West Germany, and it shortly after formed the GSG-9 that proved itself capable of kicking ass and taking names. In 1977, GSG-9 operators successfully freed hostages from a hijacked plane in Somalia in 1977. Israel did the same in 1976 in Entebbe, and France freed hostages aboard an Air France flight in 1994. These groups forced terrorist organizations to forget hijacking planes to negotiate for the release of prisoners and moved on to other attack plans. Finally, Munich taught the world a hard lesson. No one was safe anywhere. Munich ushered in the modern era of international terrorism that was crystallized to Americans on 9/11. Well, that does it for this episode. Keep those emails and messages coming. I always love hearing from you all. You can reach me at thehistorybehind the crime at gmail.com, or on Instagram at The History Behind the Crime. I hope you join me next time for a story that makes my blood boil and that has impacted, well, every woman who has ever served in the United States military. Until then, do me a favor. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Later.